The alert hit my terminal at 3 in the morning, and I knew before I even opened my eyes that something had gone wrong in the Savan corridor. I had spent the last 40 years of my career as the Concord's senior archivist of unverified species, which is a polite way of saying I was the person who filed fairy tales. Every strange signal, every ghost contact, every blurry sensor reading from the outer reaches of known space eventually ended up on my desk. I stamped them all the same way: unverified, archive, close. It was quiet work, boring work, the kind of work that lets you sleep soundly because nothing in your files is real. But that night, the file came alive. I pulled the alert up on my screen and read it 3 times because the words refused to make sense. The Savan Corridor Listening Post, our most remote outpost, staffed by a skeleton crew of 4 technicians whose only job was to listen to empty space, had gone silent. Their last transmission was automated, triggered by their emergency protocols. It was 12 words long, and those 12 words ended 4 decades of peaceful boredom in a single breath. Contact. Unknown fleet. Estimate 900 vessels. Signal repeating. They are singing. I sat on the edge of my bed and stared at the screen until my eyes ached. 900 vessels. That number alone was enough to trigger a full military alert across the entire Tessari Concord. The largest fleet any known species operated was the Kreth Dominion's Central Armada, and that numbered around 300 ships. 900 was not a patrol. 900 was not an exploration group. 900 was a statement. And there was no known power in the galaxy that could make a statement that loud. But it was the last 2 words that made my stomach turn. They are singing. What did that even mean? Ships do not sing. Weapons do not sing. Engines do not sing. But I had read those words before, buried in files that I had personally stamped as mythology. I had read them in the ancient Orakan texts. I had read them in Dreth fireside legends. I had read them in Valeth prayers that were old before the Concord even existed. And in every single one of those stories, the singing came from the same source, a species that no living person in the galaxy had ever confirmed. A species that existed only in my archive, filed under a classification I had personally assigned 4 decades ago. Mythological, unconfirmed, Class Omega, humanity. I need to explain something about humans before I go any further, because most of you have probably heard the stories and dismissed them the same way I did. In the Concord, humanity is a joke. Not a cruel joke, just a tired one. Every few decades, some deep space freighter captain or frontier patrol crew comes back with a wild story about strange ships on the edge of known space. Angular designs, no energy shields, projectile-based weapons, which is absurd because no advanced species still uses kinetic projectiles. And always, the same detail that makes the whole report fall apart. The ships were broadcasting music. Not communication, not identification codes, not warnings, music. Rhythmic patterns of sound with no informational content. Just noise arranged in patterns that served no tactical or navigational purpose whatsoever. I had a cabinet full of these reports. 14 new ones had landed on my desk just in the last 90 days, all from the Savan corridor, all describing the same angular ships and the same pointless broadcasts. I had presented them at a security briefing 2 weeks earlier, and the room had laughed. Commander Tylon, the young naval officer who had compiled the reports, had the decency to look embarrassed. I told him what I told everyone who brought me ghost stories. There is no evidence that humanity exists. The Orakan texts are 12,000 years old and considered poetic fiction. The Dreth legends are campfire entertainment. The Valeth proverbs are religious metaphor. Nobody has ever produced a verified biosyn, a recovered artifact, or a confirmed communication from a human source. Stamp it. Archive it. Close it. I was so confident. I was so certain. I had built my entire career on the comfortable certainty that the things in my files were not real, and that certainty had carried me through 4 decades without a single sleepless night. Until now. I got dressed and took the transit to the Concord Strategic Operations Center, expecting to find a handful of overnight analysts trying to re-establish contact with the listening post. Instead, I found the building lit up like a war alert. Every floor was active. Every corridor was crowded. When I reached the signals analysis room, there were already 30 people working at terminals, and Commander Tylon was standing at the central display with dark circles under his eyes and a look on his face that told me he had not laughed at anything in several hours. He saw me come in and crossed the room before I could even set down my bag. "Archivist Revon," he said, and his voice was tight. "I need you to look at something." He led me to the main display. The Sivon corridor was rendered in 3 dimensions, a long stretch of dead space between the 2 nearest galactic arms. There was nothing out there, no habitable systems, no resource deposits, no strategic value. It was the emptiest place in Concord-mapped space, which was exactly why we had put a listening post there. If anything came from outside known space, Sivon was where it would arrive first. And something had arrived. The display showed 912 individual contacts, arranged in a formation so precise it looked mathematical. They were holding position approximately 4 light hours beyond the listening post, not advancing, not retreating, not doing anything at all except existing in a place where nothing should exist. "How long?" I asked. "The listening post detected them 6 hours ago," Tylon said. "The automated distress signal went out 4 hours ago. We lost all contact with the post 90 minutes after that." "Lost contact how? Were they attacked?" "No." He pulled up the post's final sensor logs. "The post is still intact, still broadcasting its automated beacon, but the crew stopped responding. Their last manual transmission was informal, off protocol." He played it. The voice belonged to a Tassari technician, young, clearly frightened but trying to hold steady. The message was not addressed to anyone in particular. It sounded like the technician was talking to herself. "I count 912. They are not moving. They are just sitting there. And they are playing something on every open frequency. It is not a language. It is not a code. I think it is music. I do not understand why, but it is the most beautiful thing I have ever heard." The recording ended. The room was silent. I looked at Tylon. He looked at me. Neither of us said the word, but we were both thinking it. We were both thinking about my cabinet full of stamped and archived reports, and we were both thinking about the ancient texts, and we were both thinking about the species that was supposed to be a myth. "Pull up the sensor profiles of the contacts," I said. He did, and there it was. Angular hull geometry. No detectable energy shielding. Electromagnetic signatures consistent with kinetic launch systems. Projectile-based weapons on every single ship. The profile was an exact match for every dismissed report I had filed in the last 4 decades. And it was an exact match for the theoretical reconstructions I had built from the Orakin texts as an academic exercise 15 years ago. My hands were shaking. I put them behind my back so no one would see. "There is something else," Tylon said quietly. He brought up the frequency analysis of the broadcast signal. "The music. We have been trying to match it against every known species cultural database. No match. But one of our linguists noticed something. It is structured around a 12-tone harmonic system. No known species in the Concord uses a 12-tone system." "The Orakin texts," I said, and my voice sounded strange to me. The Orakin described a species that divided sound into 12 equal intervals. They called it a ladder of noise. They said it was primitive. They said it was haunting. Tylon nodded slowly. "What species were the Orakin describing, Archivist?" I did not answer. I did not need to. Everyone in the room already knew. They had known since the moment they saw 900 ships holding formation in dead space, broadcasting music into the void like an invitation or a prayer or a warning. They just needed someone to say it out loud, and apparently that someone was going to be me. The archivist of myths, the man who had spent 40 years telling everyone that this particular story was fiction. "Humans," I said. The Orakin were describing humans. The word landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. On the central display, 912 contacts held their perfect formation at the edge of everything we knew, patient and silent and singing. And for the first time in my life, I understood what the Valith proverb actually meant. If you hear music in the void, run. I did not run. I wish I had, because what came next changed everything I thought I knew about the galaxy. about my work, about the comfortable walls I had built around my life, with stamps and archives, and the soothing certainty that the impossible would stay safely inside its file. It did not stay in the file. It never had. I was just too comfortable to notice. I spent the next 3 hours at a terminal, pulling every reference to humanity from the Concorde's archives. Not just my files, everything. Intelligence reports, archaeological surveys, linguistic fragments, religious texts from a dozen species. I spread them across 6 screens, and I read them all. And for the first time I read them not as a skeptic sorting fairy tales, but as an archivist trying to understand something real. The picture that emerged was scattered and contradictory, but certain threads ran through every source. Humanity originated on a single planet in the far Spiral Arm, a region so remote that no Concorde survey ship had ever reached it. Their world was classified as a Category 9 environment, which meant it was actively hostile to complex life. Seismic instability, extreme temperature variation, a predator-to-prey ratio that bordered on statistical absurdity. The planet itself seemed to be trying to wipe out its own inhabitants on a geological schedule. And yet, according to every source, the humans survived. Not just survived, thrived. The Oroken texts described them as warm-blooded, bipedal, and stubbornly persistent. They had survived an extinction-level asteroid impact. They had survived ice ages. They had survived, according to one fragmentary account that I had always dismissed as poetic exaggeration, a period in which they had developed the capacity to destroy their own world, and then chosen not to. The Dreth told stories about ghost ships, ships that appeared near dying stars, ships that answered distress signals no one had sent, ships that showed up uninvited and unwanted, and then refused to leave until they were certain everyone was safe. The Dreth called them the uninvited. They said you could hear them coming, because they announced themselves with noise. Not engines, music. The Valeth had their proverb, if you hear music in the void. But I had always assumed it was a warning. Run, because something dangerous is coming. Now, sitting in the signals room at 3 in the morning, with 900 ships on the display, I was not so sure. The Valeth were a careful species. Their language was precise. They did not waste words on simple warnings. If they said music in the void, they meant something specific, something important, something I had missed. I was still reading when Tylon came to find me. His face was pale, and his hands were not entirely steady. They are transmitting, he said. Not music this time, a message, in our languages. I followed him back to the central display. The room was packed now. Half the overnight staff had been called in. Admiral Venka, the Concorde's chief of fleet operations, was standing at the back with her arms crossed and her jaw tight. She did not look at me. Tylon played the message. It had been broadcast on every standard Concorde frequency simultaneously, and it was delivered in 7 current Concorde languages plus 3 dead ones. The translation software had done its best, but the phrasing was strange, formal, almost ceremonial. We are the human fleet. 6th Expeditionary Group. We have been looking for you for a very long time. We come with open hands, but we will not come unarmed. Please respond. The room erupted. Everyone was talking at once. I stood in the middle of it and let the words echo in my head. 6th Expeditionary Group. That implied there were others. That implied organization on a scale I had not considered. Open hands. A phrase that meant nothing in most Concorde cultures, because most Concorde species did not have hands, but the intent was clear enough. We are friendly. The second part was equally clear. We are also ready. Admiral Venka raised one hand, and the room went quiet. Archivist, she said, looking directly at me for the first time. Is this real? I wanted to say no. I wanted to stamp it and archive it and go home. I wanted to close the file and sleep soundly and wake up in a galaxy where the things in my cabinet were still safely fictional. But I had spent 40 years learning to read evidence, and the evidence in front of me was overwhelming. Yes, I said. Admiral, I believe this is a genuine first contact event. I believe we are looking at a human fleet. She held my gaze for a long moment, then she turned to Tylon. Get me the council, she said. All of them. Now. I stood there, as the room mobilized around me, as priority channels opened and diplomatic protocols activated, and the entire machinery of the Tessari Concorde lurched into emergency motion. "912 ships, broadcasting music, asking to be heard. And somewhere in the back of my mind, underneath the shock and the fear and the professional embarrassment of having been wrong for 4 decades, there was something else, something small and quiet and entirely inappropriate for the situation. Curiosity, pure, burning, uncontrollable curiosity. Because the myths were real, and I was the only person in the Concorde who had studied them, which meant I was about to become either the most important person in the room or the most expendable. In my experience, those two things were usually the same. The council chamber was designed to intimidate. That was its entire architectural purpose. It sat at the heart of the Concorde's capital station, a vast circular room with tiered seating for representatives of all 40 member species, each tier positioned at a precise height, calculated to reflect that species' seniority within the alliance. The ceiling was transparent, offering an unobstructed view of open space, which meant that every meeting took place under the cold light of distant stars. The message was deliberate. You are small. The galaxy is large. Remember your place. I had been in the chamber before, but only as a minor functionary, delivering reports that nobody listened to. This time was different. This time, the tiered seats were full. Every ambassador, every military chief, every intelligence director, and at the center of the main floor, standing where I had never expected to stand, was me, the archivist of myths, the man who filed fairy tales, the only person in the Concorde who had spent a career studying a species that everyone agreed did not exist, and who was now being asked to explain why 900 ships belonging to that species were sitting on the edge of Concorde space. Admiral Venka had convened the emergency session 6 hours after the message was received. In that time, the human fleet had not moved. They had not repeated their transmission. They had not done anything at all except hold formation and continue broadcasting their music on open frequencies. It was, according to every military analyst in the room, either the most patient show of force in galactic history or the most sincere invitation ever delivered. Nobody could agree on which. I presented my findings to the council in the most clinical language I could manage. I walked them through the Orokin texts, the Dreth legends, the Valith proverbs, and the 4 decades of dismissed sighting reports that matched the current sensor profiles. I showed them the frequency analysis of the music, the 12-tone harmonic system, the linguistic structure of the message. I laid it all out like evidence in a case, because that was what I was trained to do. Build the file, present the file, let someone else decide what the file means. When I finished, the chamber was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. Then Ambassador Krethvol of the Kreth Dominion, attending remotely via secured channel, spoke. "This is absurd," he said. His voice was flat and cold, the way Kreth voices always were when they were about to say something dangerous. "You are asking this council to believe that a mythological species has appeared with a fleet larger than any known military force, based on the testimony of an archivist who has spent his career cataloging fiction. I will not dignify this with further analysis. Disarm them. Quarantine them. If they resist, neutralize them." Several ambassadors murmured agreement. The Talari representative shifted uncomfortably in the seat designed for their silicon-based anatomy and said nothing, which for the Talari was a form of cautious support for whichever side appeared to be winning. The Moravi ambassador, a species known for their mathematical approach to every decision, tapped at a calculation device and announced that the probability of a pirate coalition assembling 900 ships without detection was less than 1 in 4 billion, which did not seem to comfort anyone. The Dreth representative, Ambassador Colvin, leaned forward in his seat. His species had told stories about human ghost ships for longer than most civilizations in the chamber had existed, and I could see the tension between his cultural memory and his political instincts playing out in the set of his jaw. "The archivist's evidence is circumstantial," he said carefully. "Ancient texts and legends are not proof of identity. These could be anyone. A rogue state, a Kreth splinter faction, a pirate coalition with enough ships to make a statement. We cannot accept their claim at face value. With respect, Ambassador, I said, and my voice was steadier than I felt. No known species or rogue faction uses kinetic projectile weapons. No known culture broadcasts on a 12-tone harmonic system. And no known power has ever been able to assemble 900 warships without triggering a single intelligence alert. Whatever this fleet is, it is not from any civilization we have previously encountered. Which is exactly why it should be treated as a threat, Krethval said. Or as an opportunity, said a quiet voice from the upper tier. Ambassador Kethra of the Valith. She rarely spoke at council sessions, and when she did, people listened, because the Valith were the oldest species in the Concord, and they had a reputation for saying things that turned out to be important several decades later. The archivist is correct, that this contact is unprecedented, Kethra said, and Ambassador Krethval is correct that caution is warranted. But neither caution nor dismissal changes the fact that 900 ships are waiting for us to respond. Silence is also a message, and I do not think we want to discover what these visitors hear in our silence. The debate continued for 3 hours. I stood on the chamber floor and listened to 40 species argue about whether to treat the human fleet as a military threat, a diplomatic opportunity, a scientific curiosity, or a hoax. The arguments circled and repeated, and went nowhere. And through it all, the display on the chamber wall showed the fleet in its perfect formation, unchanging and patient. Finally, Admiral Venka stepped forward and cut through the noise with the efficiency of someone who had spent 40 years managing committees that did not want to be managed. "We will send a diplomatic frigate," she said. "One ship, minimal crew. We will make contact, verify their identity, assess their intentions, and report back. If they are hostile, one frigate is an acceptable loss. If they are genuine, we will have opened a channel. Either way, we learned something. Sitting here debating accomplishes nothing." The vote was narrow, but it passed. One frigate, one chance. And then Venka turned to me. "Archivist Rivan," she said, "you are the only person in the Concord who has studied this species in any capacity. Congratulations. You are now our cultural attaché to the human fleet." I opened my mouth to protest. I wanted to tell her that I had studied humans the way a historian studies ancient pottery. From a safe distance, through glass. With the comforting knowledge that the pottery could not get up and walk toward you, I wanted to tell her that I was an archivist, not a diplomat, and that my primary qualification was my ability to stamp documents and close files and go home at a reasonable hour. But the chamber was watching. 40 species, hundreds of eyes. And on the display behind me, 900 ships full of a species that was not supposed to be real, waiting in the dark with their music and their open hands and their quiet, terrifying patience. "Understood, Admiral," I said, because there was nothing else to say. I left the chamber and went straight to my quarters to pack. I did not have much: a change of clothes, my datapad, a personal archive of every reference to humanity I had ever collected, which was considerably more extensive than the official files, because I had always found the myth fascinating, even when I was certain it was fiction. I suppose that is the irony. I dismissed humans for 40 years, but I never stopped reading about them. Some part of me, some small, stubborn corner of my mind, had always wanted them to be real. Be careful what you wish for. That is a human proverb, actually. I found it in a Dreth translation of a fragmentary text attributed to an unknown source. I had always appreciated the conciseness. Now, packing my bag for a trip to meet a mythological species on a diplomatic frigate that might or might not come back in one piece, I appreciated its accuracy. The frigate was called the Steady Voice. It was a diplomatic vessel, lightly armed, designed for first contact scenarios that the Concord had never actually expected to use. The name was aspirational rather than descriptive, because the voice of everyone aboard was anything but steady. The crew was 12, myself, the captain, a communications officer, 2 security personnel, a medical officer, and 6 support staff, who all looked like they would rather be anywhere else. The captain was a Tessari named Boltren, a calm and methodical officer who had the rare quality of being genuinely unflappable. When I told him we were heading to make contact with a species that most of the galaxy considered fictional, he nodded once and asked what frequency they were broadcasting on. The two security officers were less composed. They checked their sidearms 4 times during the pre-departure briefing and asked me twice whether humans were known to be aggressive. I told them that according to the Arawakan texts, humans were simultaneously one of the most violent and one of the most compassionate species ever recorded, which did not appear to reassure them. The journey to the Savan corridor took 14 hours at maximum speed. I spent most of it in my cabin, reviewing every piece of data I had. I read the Orakan texts again. I read the Dreth legends again. I read my own dismissed reports again. And with each one, I felt a fresh wave of embarrassment, because the pattern had been there all along. The angular ships, the kinetic weapons, the music, 14 reports in 90 days, all saying the same thing, and I had stamped every one of them and put them away, because admitting they might be real would have meant admitting that my entire career was built on a mistake. I found one passage in the Orakan texts that I had always skipped over because it seemed like poetic filler. Now I read it slowly, word by word, and felt something cold settle in my chest. They are not the strongest, they are not the fastest, they are not the oldest, but they do not stop, they have never stopped. If they come for you, pray it is in friendship. For if they come in anger, there is no distance great enough to outrun them. They will follow you to the edge of everything and then build a road beyond it. I closed my datapad and sat in the dark for a long time after that. When we dropped out of transit speed at the edge of the Savan corridor, Captain Bolzrin called me to the bridge. I went, expecting to see the fleet as a collection of sensor dots on a tactical display. Instead, Bolren had opened the forward viewport. And there they were. 912 ships, spread across the darkness in a formation that looked like a geometric proof made physical. But they were not what I had expected. I had imagined sleek vessels, advanced and gleaming, the kind of ships that a species capable of crossing the galaxy would build. What I saw instead made me grip the edge of the console to keep my hands from trembling. The ships were old, not old the way Concorde vessels get old, with wear patterns and faded hull paint, old the way mountains are old the way rivers are old. These ships had been flying for so long that they had been repaired and rebuilt and patched and reinforced dozens of times over. I could see the layers. Original hull plating next to salvaged metal next to improvised panels made from materials I could not identify. Every ship was a patchwork, a history written in metal, and every ship was still flying. They were not beautiful, they were not elegant, they were scarred and dented and battered, and they looked like they had been through things that would have stopped any Concorde vessel cold. But their formation was perfect, their systems were active, their lights were on, and they were singing. Even through the hull of the steady voice, even through the vacuum of space and the dampening of our communications filters, I could hear it. Not with my ears, with something deeper, a vibration, a pulse. Music, broadcast on every frequency, filling the empty space between stars with sound that had no tactical purpose, no strategic value, no logical reason to exist. It was beautiful. That was the part that frightened me most. It was beautiful, and it should not have been. And I did not understand why a fleet of 900 warships would cross the galaxy making beautiful noise for no one to hear. Captain Bolzrin looked at me. Your orders, Archivist. My orders, as if I had any idea what to do. As if 40 years of filing myths had prepared me for standing on the bridge of a diplomatic frigate, looking at the impossible through a viewport. I took a breath, then another. Then I said, the only thing I could think of. Open a channel. Tell them we are here. The reply came in 14 seconds. 14 seconds. They had been waiting for us. Of course they had been waiting. They had been waiting for 600 years. The voice that came through our speakers was calm, clear, and speaking our language with an accent that no translation software could quite place. It sounded like someone who had learned Tassari from a textbook written centuries ago and had been practicing with no one to correct them. Diplomatic vessel. This is the human 6th Expeditionary Fleet, flagship Remembrance. Admiral Ellen Shaw commanding. We have been hoping you would come. You are welcome here. Please, dock at our forward bay. We have been preparing for this moment for a very long time. I looked at Bolren. He looked at me. Well, he said quietly, I suppose we should not keep them waiting any longer. The steady voice moved forward. One small ship, approaching 900, and the music grew louder with every kilometer we closed. It was not a warning. It was not a weapon. It was a welcome. It had always been a welcome. For 600 years, across the entire width of the galaxy, these ships had been singing hello to anyone who might be listening. And no one had answered until now. The remembrance was enormous. Not by Concorde standards, where capital ships were built for speed and efficiency, but by the raw, stubborn logic of a vessel, designed to keep people alive for centuries. As the steady voice maneuvered into the forward docking bay, I pressed myself against the viewport and tried to absorb what I was seeing. The bay alone was larger than most Concorde stations. It was cavernous, industrial, and crowded with smaller craft in various states of repair. Maintenance drones moved between the ships like insects tending a hive. People moved too, small figures in padded suits, walking on magnetized boots along scaffolding and gantries that stretched in every direction. People, humans, real, living, breathing humans. I had studied them as abstractions for 4 decades. I had read about them in ancient texts. I had cataloged physical descriptions from fragmentary sources. Bipedal, bilateral symmetry, warm-blooded, endurance predators, tool users, pattern seekers. None of those clinical descriptors prepared me for the actual sight of them. They were smaller than I expected, softer looking. Their movements were fluid and unpredictable, lacking the mechanical precision of most Concorde species. They turned their heads constantly, scanning their surroundings with forward-facing eyes that spoke of a predator ancestry they had clearly never quite outgrown. When the steady voice settled onto the docking clamps and our hatch opened, I was the first one through. Not because I was brave, because everyone else on the crew was standing very still and looking at me with expressions that clearly communicated, "You are the expert here, so you go first." The air inside the Remembrance was different from Concorde air. Warmer. Thicker, it carried a complex mixture of organic compounds that my translator helpfully identified as a combination of metabolic byproducts, food preparation residue, industrial lubricants, and something it could only classify as botanical. The humans, it seemed, were growing plants aboard their warships. A delegation was waiting for us at the base of the docking ramp. 6 humans in clean uniforms that bore the marks of careful maintenance, pressed and repaired and pressed again, until the original fabric was barely visible beneath the patches. At the front stood a woman with short gray hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from something harder than flesh. She was not tall. She was not physically imposing by any standard I could apply. But when she looked at me, her eyes had a weight to them that I had only ever seen in individuals who had carried responsibility for so long that it had become part of their bone structure. "Archivist Revon," she said, and she pronounced my name almost correctly. "I am Admiral Ellen Shaw, commanding officer of the 6th Expeditionary Group. Welcome aboard the Remembrance." She paused, and then she did something I was not prepared for. She smiled. Not a diplomatic smile, not a calculated expression of non-threatening intent. A real smile, wide and warm and slightly uneven, the kind of smile that cracked the hard surface of her face and let something bright and genuine show through. "You have no idea how long we have been waiting to say that to someone," she said. I did not know what to do with my hands. In the Concorde, formal greetings involve a precise sequence of gestures, calibrated to the species and rank of each participant. There was no protocol for greeting a mythological species aboard a 600-year-old warship in dead space. I fell back on honesty. "Admiral Shaw, I must confess that until approximately 20 hours ago, I did not believe your species existed. I have spent my career filing you as mythology. I owe you an apology of considerable scope." She laughed. It was a short, warm sound that seemed to surprise even her. "Do not apologize, Archivist. We have spent 600 years wondering if anyone was out here at all. At least you had a file. We just had hope." She gestured for us to follow, and our small diplomatic party moved into the corridors of the Remembrance, and everything I thought I understood about this fleet and these people began to collapse and rebuild itself with every step. The corridors were not what I expected. A Concorde warship is functional. Clean lines, smooth surfaces, efficient use of space. Every element serves a purpose. The corridors of the Remembrance served 100 purposes, and most of them had nothing to do with the operation of a warship. The walls were covered in paintings, not digital displays, not projected images. Paintings, applied directly to the metal surface in pigments that had faded and been refreshed, and faded again over what must have been centuries. Star maps painted by hand, portraits of people I did not recognize, landscapes showing a blue-green world under a yellow sun, scenes from what I assumed was human history, rendered in styles that ranged from precise technical illustration to wild, abstract splashes of color that seemed to mean nothing and everything at once. The murals started in the first generation, Shaw said, noticing my stare. People needed something on the walls besides metal. After 600 years, there is not much bare metal left. I stopped in front of one painting. It showed a small figure standing on a rocky shore, looking up at a night sky full of stars. The figure was reaching upward with one hand, fingers spread wide, as if trying to touch the nearest point of light. It was simple. It was crude, by any artistic standard. And it hit me with an emotional force that I was completely unprepared for. Because I suddenly understood, in a way that no archive file could have communicated, what it meant to be born aboard a ship, and to live your entire life, knowing that you would never reach the destination, that the journey was all you would ever have, and that someday your children or their children might finally arrive somewhere, but you would not be there to see it. These people had been reaching for 600 years, and the paint was still wet on the walls. Admiral Shaw led us through the ship for what must have been 2 hours, and every corridor revealed something new that reframed everything I thought I understood about survival. They stretched across an entire deck, vast chambers filled with hydroponic gardens growing food crops under artificial sunlight. The light was not quite right, too white and too even, but the plants did not seem to mind. I watched a young woman with soil-stained hands pruning a row of green stalks, and I realized she was singing quietly while she worked. She had never seen real soil. She had never stood in an open field. She had never felt rain or wind or the warmth of a natural sun on her face. But she was growing things, coaxing life out of nutrient solution and artificial light, feeding a civilization that had no ground to stand on. From the agricultural bays, Shaw took us to the fabrication decks, where engineers built replacement parts from raw materials they had mined from asteroids during the journey. The original supply chain had ended 6 centuries ago, and everything since then had been improvised. I watched a team of 3 engineers rebuilding a hydraulic coupling from scratch, melting down worn components, and recasting them using molds that had themselves been rebuilt at least a dozen times. Nothing was wasted. Every scrap of metal, every drop of lubricant, every length of wire was used and reused and repurposed until it simply could not hold together any longer. And then it was melted down and turned into something new. She showed us the schools, where children sat in curved rows and learned mathematics, science, history, and something the humans called literature, which appeared to be the study of fictional narratives. I found this concept almost unbearably ironic given my profession. These children would grow up aboard the fleet, and most of them would likely grow old aboard the fleet. And they were being taught to imagine worlds they had never seen. It was either the most pointless form of education I had ever encountered, or the most essential. I was no longer sure which. Then Shaw took us to the Memorial Hall, and I stopped being able to think in professional terms at all. The Memorial Hall occupied the entire central column of the Remembrance, a cylindrical chamber that ran from the lower decks to the upper hull. Its walls were covered in names, not printed, not projected, carved. Every human who had been born aboard the fleet, who had lived their life in the corridors and compartments and cargo bays of these ships, and who had died without ever reaching the destination, had their name carved into the wall of the Memorial Hall. 600 years of names, generations of people recorded in metal, each one a life that had been spent in service to a mission they would never see completed. I stood at the base of the column and looked up, and the names stretched above me until they disappeared into the shadows near the ceiling. 4,217 names. Shaw had mentioned that number earlier, but seeing it carved into metal was different from hearing it spoken. Each one of those names was a person who had been born in the void, who had lived in the void, who had died in the void. They had never breathed open air. They had never seen a horizon. They had maintained the ships and taught the children and preserved the gifts and done their jobs and died, and the only legacy they left was their name on a wall and the continued existence of the fleet they had given their lives to sustain. I reached out and touched one of the names. The metal was smooth and warm under my fingers. Someone had polished it recently. Someone was still taking care of these names, still honoring these people, centuries after they had gone. Every section of the ship told the same story. 600 years of survival. 600 years of making things work with whatever was available. 600 years of a civilization that refused to stop functioning just because it was trapped inside metal boxes, moving through empty space, with no guarantee that there was anything worth finding at the other end. I asked Shaw why. It was a simple question, and I expected a simple answer. I did not get one. 600 years ago, she said, our homeworld launched 12 expeditionary groups, 12 fleets, 12 directions, each one carrying roughly 1,000 ships, each one tasked with the same mission: find intelligent life, make contact, build alliances, come home with friends. She paused and looked at me directly. We did not know if there was anyone out there. We did not know if any of the 12 groups would find anything. We did not even know if the journey was survivable. The first generation knew they would never see the result. They launched anyway. Why? I asked. Because the alternative was sitting on our planet and wondering. And humans are not very good at wondering. We are considerably better at going. I let that sink in. 12 fleets, 12 directions. If the sixth group had 900 ships and had been traveling for 6 centuries, the total scope of this undertaking was staggering. 12,000 ships, scattered across the galaxy, each one carrying a fragment of human civilization into the unknown, each one alone, each one unreachable. You mentioned that your group is the 6th, I said carefully. Do you have contact with the others? Shaw's expression shifted, not dramatically, a small tightening around the eyes, a slight change in the set of her jaw. If I had not been studying her face with the intensity of an archivist examining a newly discovered artifact, I would have missed it. No, she said. We have never had faster-than-light communication. None of the groups do. When we left Earth, we left everything behind. Each group has been on its own since the day of launch. We do not know where the others are. We do not know if they survived. We do not even know if Earth still exists. The weight of that statement took a moment to fully settle on me. 600 years. No communication. No contact with home. No way of knowing if their world was still there. Every generation born aboard these ships had lived with the knowledge that they were utterly alone in the universe, connected to nothing except the mission and the people around them. And they had kept going. How? I asked. How did you maintain cohesion? How did you prevent societal collapse? 600 years of isolation should have destroyed you. Shaw smiled again, but this time the smile was complicated. It nearly did, more than once. The historical records are not cheerful reading, archivist. We had crises. We had conflicts. We had periods where the fleet almost tore itself apart, but every time, someone stood up and reminded everyone else why we were out here. Not for ourselves, for the people we might find, for the chance that somewhere in this galaxy there were others, and that those others might need what we had to offer. And what do you have to offer? She stopped walking. We were standing in front of a large sealed door, and she placed her hand on the locking mechanism. It scanned her palm, and the door slid open, revealing a cargo bay that stretched out further than I could see. The bay was full, stacked from floor to ceiling with sealed containers, each one labeled in a human script that my translator rendered slowly. Seeds, Earth botanical specimens, preserved genetic material from 712 plant species. Music, audio archives, 12,000 compositions spanning 4,000 years of human creative output. Mathematics, proofs, theorems, frameworks, and unsolved problems collected and preserved across 6 centuries of continued research aboard the fleet. Medicine, biological data, treatment protocols, pharmaceutical formulations, and anatomical research on the only species the humans had access to during their journey, which was themselves. Art, visual, textual, performative, paintings, sculptures reproduced in miniature, written works, dramatic scripts, poetry. I walked into the bay and looked at the containers, and I understood, finally, completely, and with a force that felt like something breaking inside my chest, what these people were. They were not conquerors. They were not refugees. They were not even explorers, not in the sense that the Concorde understood the word. They were carriers. They had packed up everything they were, everything they knew, everything they had created over their entire history as a species, and they had carried it across the galaxy for 600 years, not as cargo, not as trade goods, not as weapons, as gifts for whoever they found first. Admiral Shaw, I said, and my voice was not steady. I need to ask you one more question. Ask. What if you had never found anyone? What if the galaxy had been empty? She looked at me, and her eyes had that weight again, that depth that comes from carrying something heavy for so long that you have forgotten what it feels like to put it down. Then we would have kept looking, she said. That is what humans do, Archivist. We walk through fire because there might be someone on the other side who needs warmth. And if there is not, we build a fire for the next person who comes along. I stood in the cargo bay of the Remembrance, surrounded by 600 years of human hope, packed into sealed containers. And I thought about my archive, my neat, orderly archive, full of stamped files and closed cases, and the comfortable certainty that the impossible was safely categorized. I thought about the Orokin, who had seen these people 12,000 years ago and tried to warn us. I thought about the Dreth, who had heard the ghost ships and made them into stories. I thought about the Valith, who had heard the music and turned it into a prayer. And I thought about myself, the archivist who had spent 40 years telling everyone that humans were a myth, the archivist who was standing in a cargo bay full of seeds and music and mathematics, gifts from a species that had crossed the galaxy on nothing but stubbornness and hope, and who was now realizing, with a clarity that felt almost painful, that he had been wrong about everything that mattered. I closed my datapad. The myth file was no longer relevant. These people were real, and they were nothing like the stories said. They were so much more. I returned to the Concorde with Admiral Shaw and a small human delegation 3 days after our initial meeting. In those 3 days, I had barely slept. I had toured 7 ships in the fleet. I had eaten human food, which was bland by Concorde standards, but prepared with a care and attention that suggested the humans treated meals as something more than fuel. I had watched their children play in corridors that were older than most Concorde governments. I had listened to their music, not through speakers this time, but performed live by a group of humans who played instruments made of wood and metal, instruments that had been built and rebuilt over centuries, and still produced sounds that made my chest ache in ways I could not explain. And I had prepared my report. The council chamber was full again when we arrived. Every seat occupied, every screen active. The Kreth Dominion was attending remotely, which meant they expected trouble and wanted the option of disconnecting if things went badly. The air in the chamber felt dense with expectation, the way it does before a storm, and I could feel the eyes of 40 species on the human delegation as they walked onto the chamber floor. There were 5 of them: Admiral Shaw, her aide Lieutenant Philip Hartley, a cultural officer named Claire Dunning, an engineer named George Morrow, and a young woman named Sophie Grant, who appeared to serve as a combination of translator and historian. They walked with the easy, unhurried confidence of people who had survived things that would have broken most civilizations. And when they looked up at the tiered seating and the transparent ceiling and the cold light of distant stars, they did not look intimidated, they looked delighted. That was the moment I began to suspect that humans might be the most dangerous species in the galaxy, because they looked at a room designed to make them feel small, and they smiled. Admiral Venka opened the session and called me to present my findings. I walked to the center of the floor, where the speaker's platform gave me an unobstructed view of the entire chamber, and I began the most important briefing of my career. Honored council members, I said, I was sent to the Savan corridor as your cultural attaché to verify the identity and assess the intentions of the unknown fleet. I have completed my assessment. The fleet is human. Their identity is confirmed beyond any reasonable doubt by physical evidence, linguistic analysis, cultural markers, and biological samples freely provided. They are exactly what they claim to be: the 6th expeditionary group of the human species, 912 vessels, approximately 140,000 individuals, 600 years from home. I paused to let that number settle. 140,000 people, more than the population of several Concord member worlds. In my professional assessment, I continued, this fleet poses no military threat to the Concord. Their weapons are functional, but archaic. Their ships are maintained but aging. A direct engagement with even a moderate Concord battle group would result in their destruction. They know this. They are not here to fight. Then why are they here? Asked Ambassador Colvin of the Dreth. His voice carried the careful suspicion that was characteristic of his species. They are here because 600 years ago, their homeworld launched 12 fleets into the galaxy to find intelligent life. Not to conquer it, not to trade with it, to find it, to meet it, to offer friendship. They carried gifts, Ambassador. Seeds, music, knowledge, art. They carried the best of what their species had produced, and they brought it across the galaxy to give to whoever they found first. Silence in the chamber. They have no faster-than-light communications, I continued. They have been traveling in complete isolation for 6 centuries. They do not know if their homeworld still exists. They do not know the fate of the other 11 expeditionary groups. They do not know if anyone was ever going to answer their call, and they kept going anyway, generation after generation, born and raised and grown old and gone, aboard ships that were ancient before most of the people currently serving on them were born. They kept going because there was a chance, however small, that someone was out there, and they did not want that someone to be alone. I stopped speaking. The chamber was completely still. I had delivered a lot of briefings in my career, and I had never once managed to silence the room. This time, I could have heard dust settling. Ambassador Krethval broke the silence. A touching story, he said flatly. But stories do not change strategic realities. 900 warships, regardless of their stated intent, represent a concentration of military force that the Concord cannot ignore. The Dominion recommends immediate disarmament and quarantine pending a full threat assessment. Their weapons may be archaic, but their numbers are not. The Kreth recommendation is noted, Admiral Venka said. Does the human delegation wish to respond? Admiral Shaw stepped forward. She did not move to the speaker's platform. She stood on the chamber floor, at ground level, looking up at the tiers of alien faces above her, and she did not seem to notice or care that the architecture was designed to make her look small. She spoke clearly, without notes, without rehearsal, in Tassari that was accented but fluent, learned from the files and fragments that her fleet had carried across the galaxy. My name is Ellen Shaw, she said. I am the 17th commanding officer of the 6th Expeditionary Group. 16 admirals came before me, and none of them ever stood in a room like this, because none of them ever found what we were looking for. They spent their lives commanding a fleet that was looking for neighbors. They grew old. They passed the command to the next generation, and they made the next generation promise the same thing they had been promised, which was this: do not stop looking. Do not give up, because the galaxy is too large and too beautiful to be empty, and somewhere out there, someone is waiting. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was quieter, but it carried through the chamber like a bell. I am not here to argue about weapons or strategic calculations. I am here because 4,217 people died during our journey. They were born aboard our ships. They lived their entire lives in corridors and compartments and cargo bays. They never breathed open air, or felt natural sunlight, or stood on solid ground. They never met any of you. They never saw this chamber. They never knew if anyone was out there at all, and they kept going. They maintained the ships. They taught the children. They preserved the gifts. They did their jobs, and they lived their lives, and they died in the void between stars, and the only thing they asked in return was that the next generation would keep the promise. The chamber was so silent I could hear the humming of the environmental systems. The last message we received from Earth was 400 years ago, Shaw continued. The signal was fading. We could barely read it, but the words were clear enough. 4 words. Keep going. Find them. That was the last thing our homeworld ever said to us. We do not know if Earth is still there. We do not know if anyone on our planet is still alive. All we know is that they told us to find you, and we did. She reached into her uniform pocket and took out a small device. It looked ancient, worn smooth by generations of handling, its surface marked with tiny scratches and dents that spoke of 6 centuries of careful preservation. On Earth, she said, when someone welcomes you into their home, you bring a gift. This is the oldest piece of music we still carry. It was composed over 1,000 years ago, and every generation of our fleet has listened to it, and every generation has carried it forward. I would like to play it for you, if you will allow me. Venka looked at the council. No one objected. Shaw placed the device on the podium and pressed something on its surface. A sound filled the chamber. A single human voice, unaccompanied, singing in a language that none of us understood. The voice was clear and high, and unbearably tender, carrying a melody that rose and fell like breathing, like tides, like something alive that had been sleeping for a long time, and was finally waking up. I did not understand the words. I do not think any of us understood the words, but we understood the sound. Every species in that chamber, from the cold-blooded Kreth, to the silicon-based Talari, to the ancient, inscrutable Valith, understood the sound. It was not complicated. It was not sophisticated. It was a voice, singing in the dark, and it meant the same thing in every language. I am here. You are not alone. The song played for perhaps 3 minutes. When it ended, the silence that followed was different from the silence before. It was not the silence of suspicion or calculation. It was the silence of people who had just heard something true, and who needed a moment to let it settle into the places where truth goes. Ambassador Kethra of the Valith stood. She was old, even by Valith standards, and she moved slowly, but her voice was steady and clear. I would like to share something with the council, she said. Many of you know the Valith proverb about music in the void. If you hear music in the void, run. This proverb is commonly understood as a warning. For many years, I accepted that interpretation myself. But the common version is a translation, and the translation is incomplete. She paused and looked directly at Admiral Shaw. The original Valith text, in the old language, reads differently. If you hear music in the void, follow it, for it means someone is calling you home. It was never a warning, it was an instruction. Our ancestors heard the music thousands of years ago, and they told us what it meant, and we forgot. We turned an invitation into a threat, because we were afraid of what it would mean if it were real. She looked up at the council. It is real. The music is real. The people who have been singing it for 600 years are standing in this chamber. The Valith vote to welcome them. The words landed like a crack in a dam. The Tasari ambassador stood next. The Tasari vote to welcome. Then the Dreth. Colvin, the suspicious, the cautious, the careful, stood and spoke one sentence. The Dreth have been telling stories about ghost ships for generations. It is time we met the ghosts. The Dreth vote to welcome. One by one, species after species, the votes came. The Tasari voted next, as the founding species of the Concord, and their ambassador spoke with a formality that could not quite hide the tremor in his voice. The Moravi voted with a mathematical justification that ran to 4 decimal places, concluding that the statistical benefit of alliance with humanity outweighed the risk by a factor of 12. The Talari, who had said nothing throughout the entire debate, rose and simply nodded, which in Talari culture was the most emphatic form of agreement their physiology could express. Some species voted quickly, as if the decision had been made before the song ended. Others consulted in hurried whispers, weighing alliances and political consequences, and the 1,000 small calculations that govern interstellar diplomacy. But they all voted. 40 species, 40 votes. Each one adding another crack to the dam until there was nothing left to hold back. The Kreth Dominion's remote screen remained active throughout the voting, and Ambassador Krethval watched every raised hand and every spoken affirmation with an expression that grew progressively colder. When the last vote was cast, he sat in silence for a long moment. His eyes moved across the chamber, cataloging allies and enemies, and the shifting landscape of galactic power that had just changed irreversibly. Then, Without a word, his screen went dark. The Dominion had disconnected. Admiral Venka turned to the human delegation. Admiral Shaw, the vote is unanimous. Humanity is hereby recognized as the 41st member species of the Tassari Concord. You are welcome here. Shaw stood very still for a moment. Her aide, Lieutenant Hartley, was blinking rapidly and looking at the ceiling. Claire Dunning had her hand over her mouth. George Morrow was staring at the floor with the rigid stillness of someone trying very hard to maintain composure. Sophie Grant was openly crying, tears running down her face without any attempt to hide them. Shaw took a breath. She straightened her shoulders, and then she said, in a voice that was rough but unbroken, on behalf of the 6th Expeditionary Group, and on behalf of the 11 other groups who are still out there somewhere, still looking, still hoping, thank you. We have been traveling a very long time. It is good to finally arrive. I stood on the chamber floor and watched 40 species applaud, and I could not write. My datapad was in my hand, and my fingers were on the surface, and I could not form a single word, because some things cannot be filed, some things cannot be archived. Some things are too real, and too important, and too raw to be reduced to data in a system. The song was still echoing in the chamber walls. I could feel it in the metal under my feet. A voice from 1,000 years ago, carried across the galaxy by stubborn, hopeful, impossible people who refused to stop singing even when no one was listening. Someone was listening now. 6 months after the vote, I moved aboard the Remembrance. That sentence sounds simple, but it represents the most significant decision I have ever made, and I made it without hesitation, which is how I know it was the right one. The Concorde created a new position for me, Concorde Liaison to the Human Expeditionary Fleet, because someone needed to manage the relationship, and I was the only candidate. I was the only person who had studied humans, who had met humans, who had spoken to humans, and who had any idea, however incomplete, of how they thought and what they valued, and why they did the bewildering things they did. I will not pretend it was comfortable. Living aboard a human ship is an exercise in constant sensory adjustment. The gravity is slightly wrong. The air is too warm and too humid. The lighting follows a cycle that the humans call a day, a 24-hour pattern based on their homeworld's rotation, and it took my body several weeks to adapt. The food is simple and often involves the application of heat to organic material in ways that no Concorde species would consider appetizing, but the humans treat their communal meals as social events, gathering in large rooms to eat together and talk and argue and laugh, and I learned quickly that refusing to join was considered a greater insult than criticizing the cooking. I also learned about coffee. This is a liquid stimulant, brewed from the roasted seeds of a plant that the humans brought with them from Earth. It is bitter and faintly acidic, and objectively unpleasant, and the humans consume it in quantities that would qualify as a substance dependency in any Concorde medical assessment. I tried it once, on a dare from Sophie Grant, the young historian who had cried in the council chamber. I did not enjoy it. I have since consumed it every morning for 5 months, which I believe proves something about the human's ability to influence the behavior of other species through sheer persistence. The cultural exchange was the formal purpose of my presence, and it proceeded with a speed and enthusiasm that caught both sides off guard. The humans were hungry for new knowledge. 600 years of isolation had left them with a civilization that was remarkably self-sufficient, but intensely insular. They had continued to develop their own science and technology throughout the journey, solving problems with ingenuity and improvisation, but they had done it in a vacuum. When Concorde scientists began sharing their work, the human engineers fell on it like starving people at a banquet. The reverse was equally striking. Human engineering was crude by Concorde standards, but it had a quality that our engineers found deeply fascinating. 6 centuries of making things work, with limited resources and no resupply chain, had produced a philosophy of design that the Concorde had never developed. Every human system was built to be repaired, modified, and repurposed. Nothing was designed to be disposable. Nothing was designed to be replaced. Everything was designed to last, and when it stopped lasting, it was designed to be taken apart and turned into something new. Our engineers called it elegant. The humans called it Tuesday. But the most important exchange was the one that almost did not happen. faster than light communication. The Concorde had developed FTL comms 3,000 years ago. It was such a basic, fundamental technology that we had stopped thinking about it the way we had stopped thinking about atmospheric processing or gravity generation. It was simply there, a part of the infrastructure of civilization. The humans had never cracked it. That single fact was the key to understanding everything about the 6th Expeditionary Group. They had crossed the galaxy without being able to talk to anyone, not to each other's ships, not to the other 11 groups, and not to Earth. Every ship in the fleet was in direct communication with every other ship through short-range radio, but beyond the fleet's formation, there was nothing. Silence. 600 years of silence. When our engineers explained FTL comms to Sophie Grant, she sat very still for approximately 10 seconds and then asked, with a voice that shook slightly, whether it could reach Earth. Our engineers looked at each other and said yes. The distance was extreme, but a properly calibrated FTL transmitter could reach any point in the galaxy. Sophie excused herself. I found her 20 minutes later in one of the observation lounges, sitting alone, looking out at the stars with an expression that I could not read. I sat beside her without speaking, because I had learned that sometimes humans need silence before they need words. 600 years, she said eventually. 600 years of not knowing. Every person who has ever lived on this fleet has wondered the same thing. Is Earth still there? Did they make it? Are they still alive? She turned to look at me, and her eyes were bright. And now you are telling me we can find out. Yes, I said. If there is anyone listening. Someone is listening, she said, and the certainty in her voice was absolute. They told us to keep going. They told us to find you. They are listening. The FTL transmitter was installed aboard the Remembrance in 3 weeks, a joint effort between Concorde engineers and human technicians that produced a hybrid system unlike anything either side had built before. The Concorde provided the theoretical framework and the core components. The humans provided the mounting, the power routing, and the relentless practical problem-solving that turned a theoretical system into a working one in a fraction of the time anyone had estimated. But before the transmitter could be activated, the Kreth made their move. I heard about it from Captain Bolran, who contacted me on a priority channel from the Steady Voice. The Kreth Dominion had deployed a battle group to the Sivian corridor, 30 heavy cruisers and their support vessels, and they had taken up position across the corridor's narrowest point. It was a blockade, cutting the human fleet off from the rest of Concorde space. The official Kreth position was that the human fleet represented an unassessed military threat that required containment pending a full security review. The unofficial position was simpler. The Kreth were afraid. 900 ships belonging to a species that had appeared from nowhere and been welcomed into the Concorde with unprecedented speed. A species with unknown capabilities, unknown allies, unknown intentions. The Kreth were a proud and powerful civilization, and they had maintained their position in galactic politics through strength and control, and the humans represented something they could not control. Admiral Shaw received the news calmly. I was standing beside her on the bridge of the Remembrance when the report came in, and I watched her face for any sign of surprise or fear. I saw neither. She looked at the tactical display showing the Kreth formation, and she nodded slightly, as if confirming something she had expected. "How do you want to handle this?" asked Henry Cole, her flag captain. He was a quiet man with steady hands and a voice that never seemed to rise above a conversational level, even in situations that would have had most Concorde officers shouting. "Open a channel to the Kreth commander," Shaw said. "Direct, unsecured. I want everyone to hear this." The channel opened. The Kreth fleet commander was a tall, angular figure named Krethvoss, and his face on the display showed the cold, controlled composure that Kreth officers cultivated the way humans cultivated coffee plants. "Admiral Shaw," he said, "you are aware of our position and our requirements. Your fleet will submit to disarmament inspections and will remain within the Sivian corridor until the Dominion's security assessment is complete. This is not negotiable." "Commander Krethvoss," Shaw said, "I understand your concern. A fleet appears from beyond known space, and you want to know what you are dealing with. That is reasonable, so let me tell you what you are dealing with." She leaned forward slightly. 600 years ago, Our homeworld launched 12 expeditionary groups, 12 fleets, 12 directions, each one carrying approximately 1,000 ships. I command the 6th. I have 912 vessels, most of them older than your civilization's current form of government. My weapons are functional, but outdated. My ships are held together by persistence and improvised repairs. If you engage us directly, you will probably win. I am not going to pretend otherwise. Krethvos blinked. He had clearly not expected honesty. But here is what I need you to understand, Shaw continued. The other 11 groups are still out there, somewhere. In 11 different directions. They are still flying, they are still looking, and they are still human, which means they are stubborn beyond anything your strategic models can account for. If something happens to the 6th, the others will eventually find out. It might take a decade, it might take a century, but they will find out, and they will come. She let that settle. I am not threatening you, Commander. I do not make threats. I am telling you about my family, 12 fleets, 12 directions. Thousands of ships full of people who have been walking through the dark for 600 years, because they believe, with absolute certainty, that the universe is worth the journey. Those people are not going to react well to the news that one of their sister fleets was blockaded and disarmed by a regional power with 30 cruisers. Is this a negotiation? Krethvos asked, and his composure was showing cracks. No, Shaw said. This is an introduction. You asked what you are dealing with. You are dealing with a species that does not stop. We did not stop when our sun threatened to kill us. We did not stop when we nearly destroyed ourselves. We did not stop when we launched into the void with no guarantee of finding anything at all. We will not stop now. Not for 30 cruisers. Not for 300. Not for 3,000. She sat back. But I would much rather not have to prove that. I would much rather have you as a friend. Because that is why we came here, Commander. Not to fight, not to conquer, not to prove how stubborn we are. We came here because we have been alone for 600 years, and we are very, very tired of being alone. So please, if you have any capacity for it, consider the possibility that we mean what we say. The channel stayed open for a long moment. Krethvos stared at Shaw. Shaw stared back. Neither of them blinked. Then Krethvos spoke. You said 11 other fleets. You have no contact with them. You do not know where they are. For all you know, they are all destroyed. For all I know, they are, Shaw agreed. But for all you know, they are not. And the question you have to ask yourself is whether you want to find out the hard way. Krethvos disconnected. The bridge was quiet. Captain Cole looked at Shaw. Do you think they will back down? I think they will think about it, Shaw said. And I think thinking is all we need them to do. The Kreth are not stupid. They are afraid. There is a difference. And the difference is that afraid people can be reassured. Stupid people cannot. She was right. 12 hours later, the Kreth battle group withdrew from the Sivon corridor. No announcement. No explanation. They simply pulled back and returned to Dominion space. The blockade was over. 3 days after that, the FTL transmitter was ready. I was on the bridge when they activated it. The entire crew of the Remembrance seemed to be crowded into every available space, pressed against walls, standing on tiptoe, craning their necks to see the main display. The other ships in the fleet were linked by video feed, and I could see faces on every screen. Old faces and young faces, and every face between. 600 years of generations, all watching, all waiting. Admiral Shaw stood at the communications console. Sophie Grant was beside her, along with Philip Hartley and Claire Dunning, and George Morrow, and 100 other people whose names I had learned over the past 6 months, whose stories I had heard, whose meals I had shared, whose coffee I had reluctantly consumed. Shaw looked at the console for a long moment. Then she looked at me. Archivist, she said, would you like to be present for this? Admiral, I said, I would not miss it for the entire archive. She smiled. Then she typed a message into the console. I read it over her shoulder. 6th Fleet to Earth. We found them. They are wonderful. We are coming home. Keep the light on. She transmitted it. The signal went out at faster than light speed, crossing the galaxy in a direction that no Concorde signal had ever traveled, heading for a small planet orbiting a yellow star on the far spiral arm. A planet that might be dead. A planet that might be empty. A planet that had told its children to keep going and find them 400 years ago, and then fallen silent. The bridge was quiet. The fleet was quiet. 140,000 people, holding their breath. I had prepared myself for the possibility that there would be no answer. I had rehearsed, in my mind, the words I would say to comfort these people if their homeworld was gone. I had thought about what it would mean for them to have crossed the galaxy and found friends, and then discovered that the home they had left behind was dust and silence. I had prepared for grief. I had not prepared for what actually happened. The response came 17 minutes later. 17 minutes. Which meant the automated relay systems were functioning, which meant the infrastructure was intact, which meant someone was maintaining it, which meant someone was alive. The message was audio. It was garbled, distorted by distance and interference, but it was unmistakable. A human voice. A real, living, breathing human voice, coming from the other side of the galaxy. Sixth Fleet. This is Earth Station 7. We hear you. We have been listening for you for a very long time. Welcome back, Sixth. The light never went out. 11 other families are waiting to hear from you. Come home. The bridge erupted. People were shouting, crying, embracing, pounding on consoles, pressing their faces against viewports, as if they could see Earth from here, if they just looked hard enough. Admiral Shaw was standing very still at the console, one hand flat on its surface, the other pressed against her mouth, and she was crying. Not the dignified, controlled emotion of a flag officer, the raw, shaking, full-body crying of a human being who had just received the answer to a 600-year-old question. Earth was alive. The other 11 fleets were out there, and someone had been keeping the light on. I stood in the middle of it and let the noise wash over me, the cheering, the weeping, the laughter that came from somewhere too deep to be anything but grief and joy, mixed together until they were indistinguishable. I watched these people, these stubborn, impossible, beautiful people, celebrate the fact that they were not alone, that they had never been alone, that the home they left behind had never stopped waiting for them. And I thought about my archive. My neat, quiet archive with its stamped files and closed cases, and the comfortable fiction that the impossible could be sorted and shelved and forgotten. I thought about the 40 years I had spent telling everyone that humans were not real, and I thought about the 40 species who had voted to welcome them, and I thought about the Valith proverb that was not a warning but a prayer. If you hear music in the void, follow it, for it means someone is calling you home. I opened my personal log. I had been maintaining it since the day I boarded the Steady Voice, and it had grown from a professional record into something more personal than I had intended. I looked at the last entry, written the night before, and then I began to write. I spent my career filing myths. I categorized the impossible and stamped it unverified. I built a life on the certainty that the things in my archive were safely fictional, and that certainty was warm and comfortable and completely wrong. Then 900 battered ships full of stubborn, singing, coffee-drinking, hugging mammals proved me wrong in every way that mattered. I paused and looked up. On the main display, the text of Earth's response was glowing in white letters against the dark. The light never went out. The ancient Orican text was right about one thing, I wrote. They do not stop. They have never stopped. They walked through the fire of 600 years of void, and they came out the other side still carrying seeds and lullabies and a 1,000-year-old song that none of us understood but all of us felt. They crossed the galaxy because they believed someone was out there. They were right. I looked at Admiral Shaw, who had composed herself and was now speaking quietly into the transmitter, sending a longer message home, her voice steady and warm, and full of the kind of strength that does not come from weapons or shields or numbers, but from the simple, unreasonable refusal to give up. I do not file myths anymore, I wrote. I do not need to. I live inside one. And it is the truest thing I have ever known. I closed the log. Around me, the crew of the Remembrance was already planning the journey home. 600 years out, 600 years back. A round trip that would span more than a millennium, carried out by people who would never see its completion, sustained by nothing but the promise passed from one generation to the next. Keep going. Find them. Come home. They had found us. Now they were going home. And I, the archivist of myths, the man who had spent his life closing files on the impossible, was going with them. Because some files, it turns out, were never meant to be closed. They were meant to be lived.